of emptiness and some amount of dissociation or detachment. So what this sort of results in is when you take these two kinds of things, like these internal feelings, what this results in is a number of different behaviors that people with BPD engage in. So as I'm going through life, afraid of abandonment, feeling empty on the inside, feeling a lot of emotional intensity, in order to cope with that, I'll engage in certain kinds of behaviors. And this is really where the disorder part really comes in, because the more that we see these kinds of behaviors, the more outcomes get worse for people with BPD. So the first thing that they tend to do is engage in impulsive behaviors, right? So this goes back to the, I'm going to fall deeply, deeply in love with this person because I'm going to feel such an emotional high hanging out with them. This is the best person. Even though my last 10 relationships have been train wrecks, this person feels different. This person truly loves me. This is real love. This is what everyone's talking about in the movies. So I'm going to move on in with them. So we see a lot of impulsive behavior. There's also high correlations with eating disorders and BPD. We also see self-harm behaviors, which I think are really interesting because self-harm behaviors aren't always suicidal in nature. This is something that a lot of people don't understand. Self-injurious behavior and suicidal ideation are not always the same thing. Suicidal ideation is when I want to kill myself and end my life, which, by the way, people at BPD are very high risk of. So that's a very real risk. But the self-injurious behavior doesn't necessarily correlate with that. When I've worked with patients who have BPD, when I ask them, why do you cut or why do you burn or why do you do self-injurious behavior, what I tend to find is that it's almost a meditative practice for them. I'm not advocating for doing that, but if you ask them, okay, when do you cut? Well, I cut when I feel emotionally really, when the pain gets so intense on the inside and I'm so unloved. If I start cutting, that pain, the pain of the physical sensation of the cut actually knocks the emotional pain and the fear of loneliness and abandonment out of my mind. It's a very intense focusing technique. And even if you look at the methods of self-injurious behavior that people with BPD engage in, it's oftentimes things that are not damaging to the body, but actually experience the highest amount of pain. So if we look at people who cut in BPD, what they tend to do is very superficial cuts. They don't do deep cuts. They're not trying to hurt themselves. But if you look at the superficial part of the skin, that's when we actually have very, very sensitive nerves. So we have these nerves that will do light touch. So you can just do a very light touch and you can feel it, right? Even if you think about tickling, right? It's a very light touch, evokes a lot of response. So a lot of pain, actually, if you sort of focus on just on the very surface, the intensity of the pain is actually higher. So they'll engage in self-injurious behaviors. We'll also see substance use disorders as being very comorbid with BPD. And what's that about? It's, once again, I'm feeling so much pain on the inside, I want to forget it, right? And if I get high, if I get drunk, if I use some kind of drugs, then it's going to make all that pain go away. And the last kind of behavior that we'll sort of see from people who have BPD is what from the outside looks like manipulative behavior. And we'll kind of get into that in a second. But essentially what happens is that there are different ways I can deal with feeling empty or bad on the inside. And one of the ways I can feel better is to feel loved by someone else, right? So if I'm feeling very abandoned and I do something that evokes love and caring from other people, then I'll feel better about myself. So these are some common behaviors which oftentimes create all kinds of problems in the lives of people who struggle with BPD. Now, what I'd love to do here is actually pause for a second and just share with y'all my understanding. So if we take all this stuff and we kind of boil it down, at its essence, what is BPD? Here's what I've kind of come to understand. This is sort of a clinical perspective and also based a little bit on my,